On June 22, 2026, the Prime Minister of Britain walked out the door of Downing Street and handed the keys away, and I'm David. Not forced by a vote, not toppled by scandal, he simply ran out of people willing to stay. And that's when the real crisis became visible. Prime Minister Keir Starmer stepped to a microphone outside Downing Street on June 22, 2026, and did something British politics hadn't expected. He resigned while still holding a working majority of nearly 170 seats. He told King Charles III first, then the nation. Nominations for his replacement would open on July 9th, with a new Labour leader chosen by September the 1st month. Starmer didn't collapse overnight. 20 ministers had already quit during his time in office, each one a small wound to his credibility. But the cascade accelerated sharply in June. John Healey, the Defense Secretary, walked out on June 11, saying the government wasn't spending enough on defense. That public resignation came just days after Starmer's ability to hold his own party together visibly cracked. By the time he stood at that microphone, his authority inside Labour wasn't just weak, it was gone. This wasn't a loss in an election. This was a leader who ran out of arguments to ask his own MPs to stay. Watch the timeline accelerate through spring and early summer. Each resignation, each public revolt, the pressure darkens. What you're seeing is a prime minister losing control not in one crisis, but in a cascading series, each one making the next one worse. By June 11, when the defense secretary quit, it was no longer a political problem, it was a rout. On June 18, just 4 days before Starmer announced his resignation, Andy Burnham won a by-election in Makerfield, a red wall seat in Greater Manchester. He took 54.8% of the vote with a majority exceeding 9,000, a dominant result. But the real significance wasn't the numbers. It was that he had just won a seat in Parliament. The Labour Party's leadership contest is decided by the membership and MPs. And suddenly, Burnham was both, a sitting MP just elected, with immediate credibility and a platform. Within 48 hours, over 200 Labour MPs publicly endorsed him. Burnham had been mayor of Manchester for years, respected locally but not a national name. The by-election changed that overnight. When Starmer resigned 4 days later, Burnham had already crossed the finish line. He had the seat. He had the endorsements. His rivals were starting from scratch. Burnham's lead was unbeatable. Burnham was carefully positioned on Europe. He said he hoped EU membership would happen in my lifetimes, but deliberately stopped short of making it a campaign platform. He knew Leave voting constituencies that Labour needed wouldn't accept a loud rejoin promise. West Streeting had no hesitation. He called Brexit a catastrophic mistake and said Britain should rejoin the EU one day, though without a fixed timeline. Yvette Cooper, another heavyweight candidate, had been fighting Brexit since 2016 with a clear pro-European record. But the pattern was unmistakable. Every serious contender was more anti-Brexit than Starmer had been. The Prime Minister who just fallen had spent his tenure trying to move past Brexit, to say, "We've left, now let's rebuild." His potential successors weren't having it. Labour's membership, which voted heavily, Remain in 2016, would never accept a candidate comfortable with Brexit. Analysts spelled it out bluntly. The contest couldn't be won by anyone who wasn't far more convincingly anti-Brexit than Starmer. The next Prime Minister would inherit immediate pressure to realign Britain with Europe, and that pressure would come from inside his own party. The Labour Party set a clear schedule. Nominations would open on July 9, with a new leader chosen by September 1st, before Parliament returned from recess. It was a deliberate structure, designed to avoid a snap general election that could hand power to the Conservatives or Reform UK. On paper, the timetable sounded orderly. But Britain didn't have 2.5 months to wait frozen in place. A government with a transitional prime minister is paralyzed. It can't negotiate major trade deals, can't make big fiscal commitments, can't send clear signals about defense. And crucially, everyone else knows it. The EU, Washington, the markets, they all see a government in limbo and they move. They don't wait for British politics to sort itself out. Trade proposals get shelved, defense funds get redirected, policy windows close. By the time the new leader took office in September, months of momentum would already be lost. And some decisions, once delayed, can't be unmade. Watch the orange line flatline above 100%, UK public debt at 102% of GDP, peaking in 2027. 10-year borrowing costs remain elevated. Markets don't like uncertainty, and a government in leadership transition can't offer assurances about fiscal direction. Stuck debt and constrained borrowing is the trap Britain's next leader inherits. "18 months before Starmer fell, in May 2025, Britain and the EU had reached a small warming. A 12-year fishing agreement let EU boats continue harvesting in UK waters, small money, but symbolically significant. Food exports to the EU faced fewer checks, cutting non-tariff barriers. And Britain linked its carbon market to the EU's, avoiding the sharp teeth of their carbon border adjustment mechanism. None of this was revolutionary, but it showed momentum. Then, November 2025 arrived. Britain tried to join the EU's €150 billion defense fund, a massive military spending pool designed to reduce Europe's dependence on American protection. Talks collapsed over participation fees. Britain ended up on the outside, as a third-party observer rather than a member, a public diplomatic loss. A youth mobility scheme allowing young Brits to work in Europe and vice versa has been under negotiation ever since, with no agreement. And beneath all of this, the fundamental architecture remains. Britain is out of the EU. No customs union, no single market access, no freedom of movement. The May agreements were small improvements inside permanent walls. Now, with Britain's government in leadership limbo, those negotiations are frozen. The EU doesn't negotiate with transitional governments, it waits. Britain's political instability in June 2026 came at the worst possible moment. Donald Trump was back in the White House, redefining American foreign policy with a purely transactional approach. Ukraine support was uncertain. Trump had signaled potential cuts. NATO spending and burden sharing were under renegotiation. Trade and defense negotiations were happening now, being shaped by American interests first. And Britain, historically America's closest ally, was paralyzed, unable to negotiate clearly from a position of strength, unable to make firm commitments, unable to signal which direction its government would take on Ukraine, on Europe, on defense spending. Trump doesn't negotiate with transitional governments. He moves. He sets terms with whoever is in power, and he doesn't wait for allies to stabilize. The uncertainty about Britain's next leader meant London had no credible voice in these conversations. By September, when the new British Prime Minister took office, the architecture of Trump's foreign policy would already be locked. Britain would be signing on to deals shaped without British input. Keir Starmer's shock resignation on June 22 exposed how fragile Britain's political stability had become. But the real crisis wasn't about him. It was what his departure revealed about the country itself. Britain faced not one problem, but three, all converging at once. First, the economy. Public debt stuck above 100% of GDP. Borrowing costs elevated. No room for fiscal error while a government sits in limbo, waiting for new leadership. Second, the political void. 2.5 months until a new leader takes over, during which Britain can't negotiate major deals, can't send clear signals, can't move. Third, the international shift. While Britain was distracted, the EU and Washington were moving. Europe was reshaping its defense posture without full British participation. Trump was setting terms for the next era of transatlantic relations, and Britain, the historic ally, the Permanent Security Council member, was sidelined, unable to shape outcomes that would define the next decade. When the new Prime Minister finally took office in September, they wouldn't be inheriting a stable government. They'd be inheriting a country caught between three forces moving in different directions, with limited time and limited leverage to respond. That's the real story of June 22. Not the resignation itself, but the crisis it exposed and the vulnerabilities it left bare. Three crises converging while the government sits in limbo, and whoever takes over in September inherits every one of them. If you want to stay ahead of what Britain's actually facing, subscribe. I'm David. See you tomorrow.